My dear children, you look at the globe today, and you see borders that seem as permanent as the mountains. But I remember a time when the sun never set on a single flag, and I was a young man caught in the long-reaching shadows of an empire that was slowly beginning to crumble into the dust of history. I was sent to lands where the heat was like a physical weight on your chest, and the language of the people sounded like the wind through the dry grass, and we were told we were there to bring order to a world that didn't ask for our help. I remember standing guard at the gates of ancient cities where the walls had seen 1,000 years of kings before. We ever arrived, and I felt like a ghost walking through someone else's dream. We wore the heavy wool uniforms of a cold country in the middle of the desert, and we marched to the beat of drums that sounded like the heartbeat of a dying giant. I saw the way the people looked at us with eyes that were not filled with hate, but with a deep and patient waiting, because they knew that empires are like the tide, and they always eventually go back to the sea. Today you think of history as something in a book, but for me, it was the taste of salt in my canteen, and the sound of a foreign marketplace at dusk, where the smell of spices and wood smoke filled the air. I remember a man in a small village who shared his shade with me one afternoon, and he told me that a man's home is not the land he conquers, but the dirt that covers his ancestors. And in that moment I realized that all the maps in the world couldn't change the truth of belonging. I have watched the flags change, and the statues fall, and the names of the cities vanish from the tongue of the world, and I am one of the last who remembers the sound of the bugle calling us to a duty that no longer exists. You live in a time where you are so focused on your own borders, but I tell you that I have seen the greatest empires fall like dry leaves in autumn, and the only thing that remains is the humanity of the people who were caught in the middle of it all. I carry the shadows of those years in my mind, and sometimes when the room is quiet, I can still hear the rhythmic marching of feet that have been still for 70 years. Do not be fooled by the grand stories of glory and conquest, because the real story of the empire was written in the sweat of the soldiers who didn't know why they were there, and the tears of the mothers who waited for sons who had become part of a foreign soil. I want you to understand that power is a fleeting thing, and the only kingdom worth building is the one inside your own heart, where kindness and respect are the only laws. Keep your eyes open to the lessons of the past, and never let the pride of a flag blind you to the face of your fellow man. For the shadows of the empire are long, but the light of a new day is always stronger. I remember the heavy stillness of the jungle where the humidity clung to our skin like a second uniform, and the silence was so deep it felt like the trees were watching us with ancient eyes. We were told we were there to protect a way of life that none of us truly understood, and we spent our days patrolling borders that were nothing more than ink lines on a map, held by men thousands of miles away, in comfortable offices. Today you have satellites that can see every corner of the earth, but back then, the world felt vast and mysterious, and every turn in the river was a leap into the unknown. I saw men who had never left their small rainy towns now standing in the middle of a golden desert, looking at the ruins of civilizations that had fallen long before our own empire was even a whisper in the wind. It was a humbling thing to realize that we were just the latest set of footprints in the sand, and that the wind would eventually erase ours, just as it had erased all the others. I remember a night spent in a small outpost where the local villagers brought us fruit and bread, not because they loved us, but because they saw the exhaustion in our eyes, and they recognized the shared burden of being human in a difficult land. We learned to communicate with smiles and gestures, because the words of the empire didn't fit the reality of the dust and the heat. You live in a world where you think power is about control, and strength is about the weapons you carry. But I tell you that the true power I saw was in the resilience of the people who stayed behind when we finally packed our bags and sailed away. I watched the sun rise over the mountains of the north and set over the plains of the south, and in every place I saw the same longing for peace, and the same love for a patch of ground that no flag could ever truly own. I carry the memories of the men who didn't make it back, the ones whose names are carved on cold stone monuments in towns that have forgotten why they went in the first place. Do not let the grand speeches of leaders make you forget the cost of the shadows we cast across the world, and do not assume that your way is the only way. Just because you have the loudest voice at the table, I have outlived the glory and the gold and the uniforms, and I sit here now as a simple man who knows that the only thing that truly lasts is the memory of a kindness shared in a strange land. Keep your hearts open to the stories of those who are different from you, and remember that every empire eventually becomes a collection of ghost stories told by old men on their porches. For the earth belongs to no one but the life we live upon. It is a gift we must share with every soul we meet. I remember the sounds of the harbor the day we finally turned our backs on those distant shores, and the way the iron chains of the anchors clanked like the breaking of a long spell. We were leaving behind the cities we had patrolled, and the people whose lives we had interrupted, and as the coastline faded into a thin blue line, I felt a strange mix of relief and a hollow sort of grief today. You travel for pleasure, and you document every step with a photograph. But we traveled because we were told to, and we carried the images only in the back of our minds, where I have stayed for 80 years. I saw the grand palaces of governors being reclaimed by the vines and the dust, and I realized that nature has a way of swallowing the pride of men when they are no longer there to defend it. We had spent our youth serving a dream that was not our own, and when we returned to our rainy streets, we found that the world had moved on without us, as if the empire had been a fever that had finally broken. I remember sitting in a quiet pub in my hometown and looking at the hands that had held a rifle in the desert and realizing they were now just the hands of a man who wanted to plant a garden and watch his children grow. You live in a time of constant noise and shifting power. But I tell you that the greatest shift I ever saw was the moment I realized that the glory of an empire is nothing compared to the peace of a quiet afternoon at home. I saw men who had been commanders of thousands now standing in line for a piece of fish and a loaf of bread. Their authority gone with the wind of the changing era, it taught me that you should never build your identity on the title you hold or the uniform you wear, because those things can be stripped away in a single night. I carry the names of the friends who died in the heat of a jungle they never understood, and whose graves are now part of a land that has its own name and its own songs. Do not let the shiny promises of history make you forget the individual souls who are crushed beneath the wheels of progress. And do not assume that because you are strong today, you will be strong forever, for the cycle of the world is long and every mountain eventually becomes a valley. Keep your spirit humble and your hands ready for honest work. For the only empire that truly matters is the one you build in the hearts of your family. Through the years, I have outlived the kings and the queens and the generals, and I sit here now in the silence of my porch, knowing that the only thing that truly bridges the gap between nations is the simple act of listening to a story told by a stranger. Let your heart be a home for everyone you meet, and never let the shadows of the past keep you from stepping into the sunlight of a world that belongs to us all. I remember the day the final orders came, and the way the heavy brass bells in the town square seemed to toll for an era that was gasping its last breath. We watched as the new flags were raised by hands that had once been hidden in the shadows, and there was a look in the eyes of the local people that I will never forget. It was the look of a bird that has finally found the door to its cage wide open. We had been the jailers and the protectors and the strangers all at once, but in that moment we were just tired men in dusty boots ready to go home to a country that had grown unfamiliar to us while we were away today. You change your leaders with a piece of paper and a screen, but we saw the world turn over like a heavy stone, and the earth beneath it was raw and full of a life we hadn't noticed before. I saw the grand offices where I had once stood at attention being turned into schools and hospitals, and I realized that the empire was just a shell that had to crack, so the real heart of the land could beat again. I remember sitting on the deck of the ship watching the stars that had guided us across the world, and thinking that they didn't belong to any king or any government. They were the same stars that the shepherd in the hills and the sailor on the coast looked at with the same wonder. You think that the greatness of a nation is in its reach across the map, but I tell you that the only true greatness I have seen in 100 years is in the way a person treats someone they have no power over. I saw men who had been rulers of provinces now struggling to find a place in a world that no longer bowed when they walked by, and it was a lesson in the vanity of human pride that has stayed with me through every decade since I carry the weight of the secrets we kept and the things we did in the name of a peace that was really just a silence imposed by force. Do not let the polished stories of the past blind you to the truth that every throne is built on the backs of those who are never invited to sit upon it, and do not assume that because you are part of something large, you are somehow larger than the man standing alone in his field. I have outlived the maps and the treaties and the grand proclamations, and I sit here now as a witness to the fact that the only thing that truly survives the fall of an empire is the kindness that was whispered in the dark. Keep your soul quiet and your heart observant, for the shadows are long, but they cannot hide the truth that we are all just travelers passing through a world that was here long before us and will be here long after we are gone. And so the century finally turns its back on the ghost of that great machine, and I am left here in the quiet of my own garden, where the only empire that remains is the one of the seasons and the soil. I look at my hands, and I see the maps of 1,000 journeys written in the wrinkles and the scars, and I realize that the greatest victory I ever won was not on a battlefield or in the service of a crown, but in the moment I decided to be a man of peace in a world that only understood power. We spent our youth chasing the horizon for the sake of a flag. But as I sit here in the twilight of my 101 years, I see that the horizon was always right where I started, in the love of my family and the steady rhythm of a life well lived today. You are so afraid of losing your influence and your place in the world, but I tell you from the very edge of forever that the only thing you truly own is the kindness you gave away and the mercy you showed to those who were at your feet. I saw the grandest monuments of my youth crumble into the grass, and I saw the names of the men I once feared erased from the memory of the streets. But I also saw the way a simple act of friendship in a foreign land could ripple through a century and change the heart of a grandson I never met. We were the shadows of an empire that thought it would last forever. But the only thing that is truly eternal is the spirit that bridges the gap between a soldier and a stranger in the heat of a desert noon. I am laying down the heavy wool of my memories now, and I am letting the bugle calls fade into the evening breeze, because I have seen that the world does not belong to the strong or the loud, but to the patient and the humble who know how to wait for the light to return. Do not let the ghosts of history haunt your footsteps, and do not build your house on the pride of a past that has already turned to dust, for the earth is wide and the sky is deep, and there is room for every soul to find a home without needing to take it from another. I leave you the quiet of my porch and the wisdom of the long road, and I ask that you walk into your own future with a heart that is open to the whole world, regardless of the lines on a map. For the empire of the heart is the only one that never falls, and the only one worth serving until the very last sun goes down.